And I welcome you all to this roundtable on the topic trust, conflict, and beyond. As Nicole said, the problems of trust and conflict are very pressing, so I cannot promise that we'll get to the beyond part. But I promise you an entertaining and interesting discussion. My name is Tobias Wille. I'm an assistant professor of international security here at Goethe University, currently also a fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. And I had the great honor to help steer this project as academic coordinator. Today we have three fantastic speakers on this roundtable, whom I'll now introduce. We have on the right or on the left from your perspective, Martin Hartmann, who holds the chair of practical philosophy at the University of Lucerne. He was previously the dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and currently serves as the president of this university. But Martin also has a strong connection to this institution, Goethe University, where he previously worked and earned both his PhD and habilitation. Martin has a wide range of research interests in political and social philosophy, among them critical theory, pragmatism, and democratic theory. And importantly for us, he has published extensively on the issue of trust, amongst others, the book Vertrauen, die unsichtbare Macht, Trust, the Invisible Force, which won the prize for the best science book by the Austrian Ministry of Education in 2021. Martin is the chairperson of our International Scientific Advisory Board, and in this capacity has made important contributions to the development of our research agenda, for which we are very grateful. Then we have Dietlind Stolle, who is the James McGill Professor in Political Science at McGill University and the former director of the Inter-University Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. She works on voluntary associations, trust, social capital, ethnic diversity, immigrant integration, political participation, democratic backsliding, as well as on gender and politics. Her book, Political Consumerism, Global Responsibility in Action, with Cambridge University Press in 2013, and co-authored with Michel Micheletti, won the Comparative Politics Prize of the Canadian Political Science Association. And Dietlind has published in many of the leading journals in political science, among them the American Political Science Review and the Journal of Politics. She is a member of our International Scientific Advisory Board, and we are also very grateful for her advice and support in steering the project. And then we have Couldry, who is professor of media, communications, and social theory in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. He is interested in how media and communications institutions and infrastructures contribute to social, political, cultural, economic, and ethical orders. And in his work draws on social, spatial, democratic, and cultural theory, anthropology, in media and communication ethics. Nick works currently on a trilogy of books, even though I learned over lunch that he kind of still is thinking about the third book. But two books already, also a lot on the topic of humanizing the future. And the first part of this trilogy just appeared with the title, The Space of the World, Can Human Solidarity Survive Social Media and What if it can't? Just with Polity Press. And we have the copy here, and you also got some slides.
Yes, I put some slides.
Yeah, and Nick will also talk a bit about this book in a second. Nick also was a member, or still is a member of our International Advisory Board, and also made great, very helpful contributions refining the research program. It's great to have you three on the panel, three research leaders in your respective fields, and so I think this is a really great opportunity to take stock of what's going on, with trust in these troubled times, but also in trust research. So when I prepared for this roundtable, I was thinking back to 2020 when we were starting the ConTrust project. This was in the middle of a pandemic. We invented a new handshake, which was a foot check because we couldn't shake hands anymore. There was misinformation on the internet about masks, about the vaccines, and a lot of other things. Donald Trump, who was still basically going towards the end of his first term as president, advised people to disregard scientific expertise and inject bleach. And here in Germany, we had the Querdenker movement protesting on the street and increasingly radicalizing. And this all happened at a time where we're, as social scientists, we're still trying to wrap our head around Brexit and the first election of Trump to the presidency. We're talking about the rise of populism, the crisis of the liberal international order, and so on. And so we thought what we observed really challenged what was considered the main sources of trust, such as group homogeneity, familiarity, the authority of experts. And at the same time, we maybe, well, probably one has to say somewhat optimistically assumed that there still must be resources how to generate trust even in these difficult times, what we then called trust in conflict and tried to elaborate since then. And we were hoping that this kind of work would also help us produce resources really to understand what's going on and address these challenges. And now 2020 appears to be a long time ago, like basically a century, even though it's just 4 years. In the meantime, so much stuff happened. We had the Russian, like the open aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We had the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Elon Musk bought Twitter and turned it into a right-wing propaganda machine. We had the Hamas terror attacks and the war in Gaza. And now Donald Trump returned to the White House. He's musing about territorial expansion and is taking the US again out of the Paris Climate Agreement and also the WHO. And he again is staffing his administration with anti-vaxxers and climate change deniers. And of course, everyone wonders what that means for the prospect of trust, but also for the prospect of peace and democracy in our world. And so the first question I want to pose to you as panelists is where you see at this political moment the challenges to trust, obviously against the background of your work, and maybe also use that a bit to reflect on what times we are living in, basically, what is going on. And I want to start with you, Martin. Also, I mean, of course, you worked on trust and you know all the kind of problems we have with trust, but also as somebody who has been part of this community and contributed to this literature for a long time, you also can the ups and downs of trust research. And so maybe you can also say a couple of words on basically the sequence of time diagnoses and where we are now in terms of the reflection on trust in academic discourse.
So is this on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, as you said, I'm sort of like an elder statesman of trust research, though I no longer research on trust right now. I have, not just because I'm president of a university, but also because I deal with different topics in the little research that is still left. So I'm somehow an onlooker and an observer of all the discussions. And I think to say something, to begin on a positive note, since we also began with Trump and trust in Trump and these questions, what I find interesting is that trust is now, and this whole research project, trust and conflict is part of it. We begin to understand that trust is not always the solution to conflicts, as it was often seen in the past. Trust is something good, and we need trust, and it's not good if it's destroyed, and so on. I mean, that has been very powerful, in the discourse on trust, let's say 20 to 30 years ago, in the whole social capital literature, for example. Putnam was mentioned. And now, and in the philosophy literature, just to add to that, why do we trust? There was always the question, and yeah, because someone is honest, trustworthy, sincere, competent. So and then Trump happened, sort of, and we know he's not sincere and he's not trustworthy and he's not honest. He's lying, in fact, very often. And still, we talk about trust. So something happened there too. If you look at it, historically, and I think we're now more open not only to the challenges of trust, but also to sort of trust as a challenge, right? Obviously, there's something, you may call it unjustified trust or bad trust or maybe even dirty trust. Like dirty care is a concept in philosophy, in feminist philosophy. That's something I find interesting, about some of the present research. Though I think it has not been dealt with, extensively and should be dealt with a lot more. That it seems to be the case that some forms of trust are, in some sense, forms of trust, but still destructive in ways to be specified. And calling it unjustified is just one thing, but what does that mean? And I think that we still, I think we should reflect more upon what it really means and move away somewhat from merely conceptual questions. And that, I think, was an idea that was discussed here in this context and should continue to be discussed. Obviously, some forms of trust can close people in. Maybe Trumpists really trust Trump. We still have to understand how that is possible. And I read about this, and there are different answers to these questions. Why should you trust a person who is so dishonest? Well, we have to think about that, and we should do. I think we should do it. Calling it unjustified is correct, probably, but not helpful in analytical terms. We need to understand from the perspective of these Trumpists what it means, what they might mean if we call what they do trusting Trump. And I think that doesn't happen enough right now. So I would distinguish somewhat an internal perspective from a people's perspective, if you want, from an external analytical perspective. And we've had a lot of external analytic perspective today. Actually, that has also been the case in a lot of recent philosophical research, certainly, a lot of concept mongering. I think we need to move somewhat away from that and get a little closer to the phenomena and to what I would call the practice of trust, and develop conceptual tools in terms of better understanding some of these negative or problematic forms of trust. So that would be a suggestion I have, just for the moment. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. So we start, I think, with the first stock taking and then see where this takes us. Dietlind.
Okay, so I prepared a few comments. So first of all, I want to thank you, the ConTrust project, for inviting me, for being on the advisory board, and for being here. As Tobias said, my work has previously dealt with trust, and like Martin, I have also taken a break. And for this conference, I came back to my earlier work on trust and to the more recent work that also was related more to the ConTrust project. So I think the topic of trust could not be more pertinent at this time when we face difficult challenges in advanced industrialized democracies that doubt the very foundations of democratic regimes. We knew for a while that there are there is a decline in mainstream political parties, that radical parties are rising. But what we didn't know, and what is happening now, is that extreme parties are also in power and getting to power. And that is what's different. And the political discourse has turned aggressive. The acceptance of political violence has increased. And the hatred between political camps is at an all-time high. So my point today, for this very short intervention that I was given a few minutes, is that polarization is a serious threat of our time and has unexpectedly not only political consequences, which I will talk about, but also social repercussions, particularly with regard to certain types of trust. And here I'm looking at this generalized trust. And now this is usually seen as this kind of Putnamian trust, but I think it isn't. It is and it isn't. I mean, he coined the term, but he made distinctions between different types of trust. And that is the trust that is really the trust towards strangers, which I think is a desirable attitude in democracies, because this is, we don't have any knowledge about others. That's the type of trust that allows for the first collaboration, for the step forward. And if we don't have that, then we cannot solve our political problems. I mean, that is largely the argument. So let me first talk a little bit about polarization, the rise of polarization. It's partisans increasingly dislike and distrust those affiliated with the other political party or parties. And this means the perception of if you win, I lose is growing, right? Each political side views the other one and their supporters as a threat to the nation even, and a threat to their way of life if that political party is in power. Essentially, affective polarization is about people's feelings, and an affectively polarized society is divided into mutually hostile camps and teams. And it's like a sports team, but much more hostile when you hit each other. And so this is, of course, strengthened right now. So one kind of way of looking at this is that this identity is rising. The other one is that the second theory is perceived that there are just policy disagreements that cannot be kind of solved together. And so that becomes a central driver for affective polarization. People dislike the other view, the view on abortion, the view on the welfare state, and the view on gun violence, transgender bathrooms, and so on. And that's, of course, exacerbated by the media and elites. So this polarization in the two-party system, as in the US, means that Democrats and Republicans both say that the other party's members are hypocritical, selfish, less intelligent, and closed-minded. They are unwilling to socialize across party lines more and more over time, or even to partner with the opponent in a variety of activities. The research finds that the average feeling thermometer for the other party has fallen from about 50% to 20% now, and even below 20%. And that is true for both sides. Polarization is not just a phenomenon of two-party systems, as we know. It is also part of the German political system, political culture, as we now see, especially, of course, in an election campaign, polarization is always heightened, but it is there also in Germany. It doesn't have the highest level of polarization, comparatively speaking. And some of the polarization is also focused a lot against the AfD, but there's also a lot of other polarization in the German party system going on. If we measure it, we see it. It's not just an AfD-related phenomenon. So what are the consequences of this? What's going on in our Western world, and Germany and the US are not the only cases here. Of course, polarization, and I should say that very clearly, has benefits, right? It increases political competitiveness. It lets parties express clearer views of their programs and positions. It leads to higher levels of political mobilization. And there are many more. No doubt that the degree of polarization is healthy in democracies. In fact, the concept of democracy supports the idea of distancing oneself from the political opponent, pointing to flaws in the political opponent's ideologies and even their character. However, it also requires that we accept when the opponents win. It requires that we accept the basic premises of an opponent's argument, or at least to make a logical argument against their views. Those in the political realm, then partisan identities with opposing blocks of principles and values at the core of partisan identity, justify intergroup competition, biases, and conflicts. In short, office holders mobilize, manipulate, and distort public opinion. So office holders and politicians are usually behind that increased feeling. So my point here today is that if polarization becomes extreme, it can critically threaten trust in others and help to erode trust in political and particularly in the process of democracy, which in turn challenges the foundations of democracy. So I want to talk about three processes here very, very briefly. I don't have time, right? Tobias is watching the time. So firstly, legislative and executive political institutions have always been politicized. So there's no surprise here. And we have often found that once your own party is in power, we have more positive views of the legislature. So that is normal, like Citroen, all these people have talked about this. However, what is perhaps a new development is that polarization has led to an overall decline of political trust, independent of the political affiliation. So when only 28% or so say that they trust the federal government, or about just below 30% in Germany, and 85% of Americans say they don't think elected officials care what people like them think before Trump took office. So this is one development in terms of polarization. This is an expected development, but that has increased this kind of opposition. The second is that there's a mechanism that is also a political experience, what researchers call the subversion dilemma, which is that polarized partisans are the most susceptible to the belief that the opposing party intends to subvert democracy. And they have no trust in that in the polarized system, that the opposing party will keep up the system of democracy, which is so dangerous because it leads to, first of all, there's a lot of distrust involved here, but it also leads to the attempt of trying to keep your party in power when there's a threat that the opposing party could come to power and could subvert democracy. So that's number two. But there are other types of institutions, and they are based on a different logic, namely in juxtaposition, and maybe the most controversial here of what I say, in juxtaposition to the sheer political institutions based on partisanship. The reason for trusting, for example, civil servants, judges, the police, and scientists, and the social service institutions is their even-handedness and impartiality. That's why we should trust these institutions where we don't have elected officials running them. Even more importantly, though, we see that polarization is making dents in these types of trust in these institutions. That is also a new development. We can see that polarization is behind the fact that such supposedly neutral. Now, I'm not saying they are impartial and neutral in all of these countries. There's lots of problems with the police in some countries and so on, right? I'm not saying that. But you can see a relationship between polarization and the declining trust, even in these institutions. The decline of trust is not as high as it is on the political side, but it is there and is remarkably there also in Germany, and particularly also in the US. Party leaders convince their electorate that these institutions are untrustworthy and those damaging the trust in them, the basic trust in them. And this discourse embedded in polarization has the results that we see these drops in trust in the Supreme Court, in universities, in schools, the police, and other such institutions over the years. And their analysis indicates that it is linked to polarization in part. Similarly, that trust is in decline in Germany below the OECD average. And evidence in part also shows, experimental evidence shows that although it has been difficult to manipulate polarization in experiments, we can talk about this, extremely difficult, I think, and to successfully manipulate it. But there have been some indications that that is also true in an experimental setting, that this trust is affected in an experimental setting. So why does this matter so much? And I'm coming to my conclusion here. My previous research has shown that these institutions play a fundamental role for the maintenance of social trust, for generalized trust in particular, based on the theories, and some of you have written about this here, I know that, I've looked at your papers, based on the theories of procedural fairness and impartiality. My research found that when the trust in these institutions is damaged, it can spill over to trust in other people. And that is an argument that we have shown with longitudinal data together with Bo Rothstein at the time. And this is so important. I can talk about the causal mechanism, but in the interest of time, I leave it at that for now. I just want to say that polarization now has, the power to paint these institutions in a partisan light, which really doesn't bode well for the future of democracy, where we need these institutions as basic kind of guarantees, guarantors of trust. However, there are other ways how polarization shapes trust. Very briefly, it does not only work through the institutions. Politicians demonize not just opposing parties and leaders, but also their supporters, which directly influences how people look at the supporters of the opposing party, also influencing generalized trust. And we also see signs of the perception bias that has been already talked about, that in this kind of world, we are looking more inward. Our in-group trust is rising. We only trust people that we know well, that we know have our values. Then we don't need trust anymore. We rely on them. But so the generalized trust is threatened. So I think it's worth thinking about this more and to also think about the mechanisms that could stop this process from happening and from developing further. Thank you.
Thanks, Dietlind. May I push you a bit on the time diagnosis? So, I mean, polarization in a way is a process, right? That's advancing. Would you also say there has been a kind of qualitative shift recently, or maybe also there might be one ahead where we get something like a tip? I mean, many of the problems you described, there are points where you can get, for example, where like if trust in the democratic process declines so much that parties stop believing that when they ever lose power, they will ever get it back, for example,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So these are dangerous tipping
points,
has
right? Been, for example, also been the case now with Trump.
Yeah.
We can discuss that, whether that was the right thing to believe or not. But
on the right messaging is
yes, exactly. But it is not only the case there. Yeah. It is the case in other systems as well. So that is one. And then, of course, also the acceptance of political violence towards the other side has been increasing very much. Yeah. Although there are some arguments about how to best measure it, and some measurements lead to less acceptance of violence and some to more. But the trend, when we measure it repeatedly, is there.
So, I mean, you haven't quite committed to whether this is kind of a new age we enter or whether this is kind of
it's a qualitatively different type of polarization. I think that leads to extremism, extreme animosity towards the other side.
Yeah, which is obviously highly troubling, and we'll come back to that. But let's continue with Nick and his first kind of tour of the horizon.
Right. Well, it's very nice to be here, and thank you, Tobias. But I feel a bit of an interloper because I'm not a political theorist, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't normally work on trust. But anyway, I do want to say something about the growing issue of trust in technology, especially trust in large technological systems like social media platforms. And I do think trust is the word rather than just de facto reliance. The period before Trump's inauguration contained many shocks, but an important one came when Meta abandoned the principle of fact-checking on their platforms. Initially, at least just for the US, but with the possibility of extending this elsewhere, shifting instead to the decentralized model that X under Musk calls community notes. The politics of this were blindingly obvious. Mark Zuckerberg aligning himself and his corporation with the new president, with Elon Musk, and I wrote this about a week ago before what's happened this week, but I didn't update it, with the discourse of free speech, which itself is just a thin disguise for the assertion of oligarchic power over speech. And for those who push this new free speech agenda, it's not clear that trust matters to them anymore. In another announcement in late December, Meta, according to the Financial Times, said that they would make its platforms now more entertaining. Well, they couldn't make them less entertaining, really, from my point of view, but more entertaining by encouraging them to be populated by AI-generated characters. And in this new social world, therefore, trust seems little to do with interpersonal trust. It's merely a functional value of an interface with which people are seen to be interacting profitably for the system, which suggests more broadly an imposition by large platforms onto society, but at scale, of an ersatz version of trust. So I wonder what the consequences of this may be. For sure, one consequence will be that many people stop using meta platforms as places for political discussion, though others, those who want the free rein to offend other people, may for the same reason be attracted to them. Another consequence, particularly relevant to us here, is that before long, I believe there will be no credible basis for trusting anything that circulates in public, and indeed no future horizon within which we might anticipate that such trust as still exists can be redeemed somehow. The community notes model on X, after all, depends entirely on our trust in the trustworthiness of the community doing the noting, which is exactly what is in question today. When we combine that point with the established facts about social media's long-term impacts on older, trusted sources of information, such as journalism, especially local journalism. And by the way, one fact checker who worked indirectly for Meta and was interviewed about its change of policy by The Guardian last week was a former local journalist who lost his job because of Meta. When we look at all of that, I think we are facing the abandonment of any credible model of how the public sphere in the broadest sense should operate, what its norms should be. Yes, we may hope that the EU will use the provisions of the Digital Services Act to challenge Meta's and X's moves. But as we saw, Mark Zuckerberg in his announcement a few days ago already anticipated working with President Trump to face down this challenge with threats of trade sanctions, perhaps as part of the negotiation. That's already becoming true. I wrote that 10 days before it became true. It's already been threatened today. So the larger question then is, regulations or not, is what this new model of the public sphere does to the sources of trust that must underlie any practice of, if you like, civility when we're discussing or informing issues of public importance. So that's really why I come in as a social theorist. Are the sources of trust themselves being threatened by this? I can't comment on the complex definitions of trust, but the social sources, I think I can. And in this book, which Tobias kindly mentioned, published late last year, The Space of the World, and Human Solidarity Survive Social Media, and What If It Can't? And if you haven't got a discount leaflet, I'm being ruthlessly marketed. There's more here, and you get 30% off if you apply through the publisher's website. In that book, I basically argued that this problem we have with trust, or the sources of trust, but also, and there's a whole chapter on it, the problem with effective polarization, which I trace back to the debates on social psychology in the 1980s, social identity theory, and many other social problems, the collapse in factuality, all of them can be traced to one fundamental error made by humanity over the past 2 decades, which is that we allowed businesses to build for profit what I call the space of the world, which is basically the multidimensional or hyperspace, the space of all possible spaces of sociality, where we are social. We allowed that, if you like, social tissue to be built for profit. That was a category error. And the impact of that category error is obviously deeply worrying in many ways. It's a problem, going back to a phrase that Mark Warren used earlier, in our ecologies of communication. We've toxified our ecologies of communication. But when, as now in the US, key commercial platforms form an alliance with political power to dismantle the scarce resources for building trust in political debate that we do still have, then we are entering a new phase of the crisis in our space of the world, even darker than what I imagined in the book. In short, over 2 decades, humanity, we basically built the wrong space of the world. So the argument of my book is that we have to rebuild a different one, which is a very large task. But that's what we have to do if we are to have any chance of avoiding destroying the social basis for trust in public discourse.
Well, thanks. Which is also, I guess, deeply worrying what you tell us here. I have one specific question, just because the whole story you tell, it's so timely, and it just you wrote the talk 10 days ago, but basically yesterday watching the news, I thought, wow, you must be revising the talk. And one thing I wonder about, so your argument is that that these platforms, that they basically created this space and maintain the space for profit. And in light of the most recent developments, I wonder whether you still think this fully applies, especially to X and Elon Musk, or whether this is not just for profit, but basically he ruined X, but whether these are political agendas that go beyond the maximization of profit or the accumulation of capital.
Well, sorry, I couldn't update my speech yesterday. I was teaching, but I just had to follow the news as best I could. But well, Musk is a rather special case. Yes, only a person of extraordinary wealth can use billions of dollars to buy a platform, then to trash it within weeks. So That is not typical even of billionaires. So we can't draw too many conclusions for him. But I think in relation to all platforms, I see them as, although my argument is not dependent on my other work on data colonialism, the theory of data colonialism I developed in separate books with Ulysses Mejias is that the whole world is now being taken as a target of extraction by power and has been for 5 centuries. We're just seeing the latest evolution of it in terms of data extraction, which is what we call data colonialism. But part of that theory is that that generates value either for corporations or governments. In China, you can't distinguish the two. The corporations were formed by the government. In America, we thought we could, until maybe now we can't, at least in the cases of people like Musk, or maybe Zuckerberg, because I heard from a member of my family today that Meta is dealing with complaints that then that people on Facebook are being told they're now following Trump and now following Vice President Vance, even though they're not. The claim is that POTUS is just a loose signifier, and whoever becomes president, you're following. But I don't think that's what anyone meant by it, and it's certainly not they trusted that phrase to mean, or they trusted the act of following to mean pointing extensively at an actual person rather than any X that could fill that spot. So something very interesting is going on there with Meta too, but that fits in with my thesis. The problem is we allowed extractivism to extract from the tissue of the social. And that's an awe-inspiring mistake from which we have to claw our way back. The precise way the benefits play out in any one situation isn't, because obviously if you control a platform of this sort, you literally control the space of all possible spaces, then why wouldn't political power be attracted to you? And it is in almost every country.
So is your solution to make it public, like utilities or whatever?
No, well, since our governments are weaker and our regulators are weaker, that will be extremely difficult at the moment. I think the only way forward, we do need regulators. Regulators, one thing they need to do is allow us to move our contacts between platforms. Not many people like Facebook, but they can't take their contacts away. So there's no actual free market in platforms, even though these platforms say they're commercial. That will be parts of regulators are part of it, but also I think we need popular movements, a popular rising to say this is not the life we want. This is not a basis for any public life. But I do believe that some platforms like Mastodon, not so much Blue Sky, federated platforms closer to communities, closer to the sites where trust could be generated in moderation, are the way forward, but they can't survive because of the fact that regulators have not allowed us to move our contacts around, so we're not free agents.
Martin?
Yeah, I would like to, I hope it's okay if we
definitely.
establish some dialogue. You know, just listening to you, I get the impression, okay, some kind of nostalgia. There was some good past, high levels of trust. And now we're in pretty bad times, low levels of trust, polarization, rising populism, etc. And I mean, my point was to suggest that we need to rethink this kind of approach to trust. And I mean, populists are being elected. Yeah, Trump had, I don't know, slightly more than 50% of the vote. Or less, I don't know, in terms of popular vote. Okay, but enough to gain the electoral committee. So let's say people, as we said before today, Trumpists somehow trust Trump to do whatever whatever it is that they trust him to do. Let's say it's a kind of trust. We don't like, we don't understand, we might find it bad or unjustified. But then I think this narrative of something has been destroyed, some good old high level of trust has been destroyed, and it's just gone. It evaporated. It's maybe not quite correct. Maybe new kinds and new forms of trust have developed, as I said, which we might not yet be able to really understand. But just listening to you, I wonder, where is that? Maybe that doesn't show up in the polls. In the trust research polls, the World Values Survey, which is so often used, and I know it's very important and has a great impact on. I could say more about that. Because it is sometimes used I think, in a highly politicized way, for example, in migration research. Yeah, but my point is, maybe this new trust that I'm not yet really able to fully understand, or we might not be able to fully understand, is some sort of trust. And maybe we don't capture it in our statistics. Maybe we do. Maybe we capture it in electoral terms. In many countries, we seem to be able to do that, right? It's happening. But do you get my point? I mean,
Sure.
Don't you think that we need to rethink some of these old approaches to trust, which had some good trust in the public, and now we no longer have the good Habermasian public sphere. It's destroyed through social media, but a lot of people use social media and enjoy it and inform whether we like it or not. They use it as a medium of information about even political matters and so on. So maybe we need to approach that. Maybe we need to sort of redevelop our concepts.
I'm not really being nostalgic. I might have sounded it because things are changing in a way that appears negative in the short term. But my argument isn't really about, it's not centrally based on trust, actually. And I agree with you that just as solidarity is not necessarily good, because you can have solidarity amongst thugs. Equally, trust isn't necessarily good. I do get that point. But my argument's a different one, which is that, sure, authoritarian leadership is also not new. Populism is not new. But something is new, which is that 30 years ago, we started to become connected through the internet, which was a radical shift in history. We're not connected to other points until that moment. And when that happened, the bad stuff in the world was able to circulate much more widely and faster than it ever could have done before. And then 10 years later, instead of creating platforms that would start to manage that risk, stop bad flow, we did the exact opposite. We created platforms that accentuate that risk, and in fact, make profit out of it being worse. So I'm not saying that we've lost something. I'm saying that we've gained something in a sense which is extraordinarily dangerous. And I don't generally believe that the social fabric is compatible with it. Any social fabric. It's just not compatible with this. We cannot go on living this. We have to address this problem. And so I see the problem slightly bigger than the particular issue with Trump, which is one version of it. And yes, nostalgia does get in the way of our analysis of Trump. I do agree on that particular point.
I'm also not sure about the nostalgia part, but I think we are seeing a qualitative shift in trust, being less thin, being more thick, and being more oriented towards your group with the same political values. And that's what we see, the social sorting into parties, the interaction in these, that's also Weimar in a way, right? We have the garden club of the Social Democrats, of the Nazis and so on. And so we are compartmentalizing, and I think social media allows us to compartmentalize it. It's a tool in that process that makes that even easier. And so we do see qualitative shifts in trust, I think, away from the kind that potentially can lead to collaborations and true solving of collective action problems to, some sort of confirmation of the internal group. And that is, I think, what we see. I think we are not completely great in measuring it in all forms over time, but there are some examples.
I mean, it also seems to be very strongly driven by dissatisfaction with the performance of, incumbent parties, but also political systems. So in a way, the bar is also really low. What the kind of populist or kind of alternative offerings have to bring, right? So in a way, it's an easy game to argue against that. And I think when we saw just the beating all the incumbent parties got in Western democracies, I think this must also be part of the story, that really crisis after crisis and problems with the performance of existing democratic systems also, I think, are driving this as well, which also might contribute to this qualitative shift, right? That the new different forms of trust probably also arise because people trust some disruptive forces really just bring change in any form, right? And so I think it's a pretty low bar in a way.
I should maybe also add that I don't believe that the 50s were the golden age with generalized trust, because generalized trust was not true generalized trust. It was also racialized and gendered and all of these other things, obviously. So I should add that now I think these cleavages are, you know, overpowered also by or even made deeper by the political aspect of it. And so that's what's happening, right?
Martin, one question for you, because you have been following the trust debate for I think 20 years probably, right? So so what we are doing here, right? Trust research, or people interested in trust sitting there trying to make sense of what's going on, also in times of problems and maybe crises. I think that happened before, right? So for example, the whole debate about social capital obviously arose in the moment where people were really concerned that social capital was in decline, for example, right? Or about the social transformation in Eastern Europe, and people were very concerned, and then that kind of also spurred academic debates. What is your sense about the moment we're living in now? Is that kind of the same story all over, new problems, new reflections on trust, new concepts again, or is this different?
Well, that's a very broad question. Trust is a crisis. Right now, it's a crisis category. I mean, and it has been for the last 20 years, I think. It's certainly in public discourse, in political discourse. You know, when I sometimes get journalists wanting an interview, but they always want it when something happens that they consider a crisis, like the Vertrauensfrage now in Germany. You know. Then all of a sudden they call you, what's going on in Germany? You know, this is a big problem. What's going on? So it seems to be, you know, from the journalistic point of view, it's totally a crisis category, and also in I think, the larger public discourse. And I mean, that's just, I don't know whether that will go on, but I assume it will. But I also assume that maybe, I mean, I don't know, maybe here's an interesting, I don't know if this is an interesting remark. When I give lectures on trust in non-academic contexts, the public is mostly slightly aged, shall I say? Sorry. I mean, as I am. So there's not a lot of young people there. Maybe that's because young people just no longer attend lectures. I don't know. Maybe that's a general problem because they use social media and so on. But I don't know. It seems to be. I wonder whether this is also somewhat a generational difference. Maybe because as a young person you don't care as much about trust as older generations do for various reasons. Some of them might make sense. But I think we should contextualize our whole, you know, discourse on trust a lot more than we do. It's always taken to be as a general category: low trust, high trust, trust in politics, trust in parties. I don't find that. I'm not saying it's unimportant, and I mean, why should I? And it does tell you a lot about our present time, and you said so. I mean, it's relevant. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I would ask certainly the research that we do to, as I said, to get closer to different kinds of practices of trust or of distrust or of mixtures between trust and distrust, and to see trust more as a process category and not, you know, it's like it explains everything and nothing. It risks, I think, and certainly in public discourse, becomes somewhat empty. Yeah. You know, it's like, I mean, it's everything. You know, trust, like the Urvertrauen was discussed earlier on, the Erikson. You know, in public discourse, people love it. They always ask one question: don't we all need Urvertrauen, right? The Erikson, which basic trust, and it's, I mean, it's not really helpful, but it shows you there's some sentiment of it's so nice. It would be so nice if we still had it, and so it's interesting in a diagnostic way. Something seems to be at risk for for a lot of these people. And I'm not saying that's irrelevant. It is relevant. But I think we as researchers are sometimes too far still from these kinds of perceptions. And I think I would, you know, recommend to I don't know, to deal, as I said also, I repeat myself, less with some of these conceptual questions. They are important. I am a philosopher after all. But I think let's move closer to sociology, to ethnography, and to get these disciplines work more closely together, because I think philosophy sometimes is too far away from some of these developments that I've been describing. And then even in philosophy, the category of trust risks to become a bit empty because it's the concept of trust, you know. And so I sometimes used to say that's what I mean by practice, but I should say by practices. I think we should move closer to different kinds of practice. We should be much more aware of the power dynamics within some of these trust-related practices. After all, Annette Bayer's classic paper is basically a feminist paper. It's a critique of Kant. You know that. It's a critique of Kantian ethics. And it deals with marriage and inequality and power within marriage and the difficulty of even realizing realizing what's wrong with a seemingly trusting relationship. So that has been forgotten somehow. That whole embeddedness of that very early, great, Annette Bayer, she's written fantastic stuff on trust, but people read only one paper. And she's published a lot, and then power is always very relevant. And I think so. There are several problems. I'm now rambling on, but I hope you see the point. I think we as researchers should somewhat take care of trying to be more specific about the way we use trust. I think it's risking of becoming really empty in many contexts, not just public contexts, but also in some academic contexts, like some wondrous category that helps us to explain everything. I think it doesn't, not if we use it in that way.
I mean, in a way, this is also a challenge, but also an opportunity, I suppose, for interdisciplinary research, because of course there are colleagues in anthropology in particular who are very much in touch kind of with the experience with trust in the life world and also different experiences in different kind of contexts and life worlds. And on the other hand, there's philosophical reflection, there's more kind of quantitative work. And what we have been trying here at ConTrust, of course, is try to stage a dialogue also and learn from each other. But I mean, this is a huge challenge. I think it's all these things you mentioned, they're all important, and somebody somewhere in academia is working on this. It's just that we are not talking to them, we haven't found them yet, or they're not interested, we're not, whatever the problems are. But I think it's also a big challenge to bring all these kind of different perspectives together, synthesize somehow, and use all these kind of available sources of inspiration to advance our academic understanding, intellectual understanding of the trust problem. I mean, there's a big kind of complex of questions I wanted to talk about what this actually means for the academic enterprise, for the methodological innovations we need, and so on. But because there is so much interesting stuff on the table already, I would propose that we open it up now, get the audience involved, and then if there's time left, we might turn to the kind of more methodological questions that come out of it.